Hello everyone, welcome to presentation on Compare and Contrast Arnold and Tennyson as Poets of the Victorian Era. Course title Victorian Poetry, Code 309. Instructor our Honorable Professor K.M. Wazed Kabir. Presented by undergraduate student Shagorika Yasmin Sara, ID 2019-20024, Department of English, Green University of Bangladesh. Topic outline: Introduction, Victorian Era, Matthew Arnold and Alfred Tennyson, Compare and Contrast, and Conclusion. Victorian age bears two greatest poets of the English literature of all time. The first is Alfred Lord Tennyson and the other is Matthew Arnold. They both are genius on their place. No one can hold the dignity of another. They both enjoy the gift of heavens. They both have the poetic fire. The muse has been very tender to her both sons. Therefore, to make an analogy amid these two great figures of the English literature is a very difficult task. Still, I can try to exercise my wit to present the qualities and special merits of both of them as a poet. This effort will lead to make certain perceptions that discriminate the two great poets, their style, their views to art and poetry, and more. Victorian Era. In the history of the United Kingdom, the Victorian Era was the period of Queen Victoria's reign from 20 June 1837 until her death on 22 January 1901. Matthew Arnold was an English poet and cultural critic who worked as an inspector of schools. He was the son of Thomas Arnold, the celebrated headmaster of Rugby School. Alfred Tennyson. First Baron Tennyson was an English poet. He was the poet laureate during much of Queen Victorian reign. In 1829, Tennyson was awarded the Chancellor of Gold Medal at Cambridge for one of his first speeches, Timbuktu. He published his first solo collection of poems, Seafly Lyrical, in 1813. Compare and contrast. Each of these Victorian poets has a distinct voice or tone, though if we were to find a common element among them, it would probably be that of an underlying sort of acceptance of the external world and nature. It is the way to each one expresses this that is unique, the view towards art and poetry. The first and foremost point that discriminates the great literary figure is undoubtedly the view towards art and poetry. Moreover, the two Arnold and Tennyson are not the exceptions. There are certain differences in their perceptions about art and poetry. Though they are the representatives of the same age, both the poets were aware of the falling standard of art in the age of Victorian flourishing. Amid the topsy-turvy of faith and belief, both the poets had to choose their way different and set a standard of themselves. We have certainly to rank Arnold above the Tennyson in this regard. Arnold was very early to know what the standard of poetry should be. He decided the way of his poetry growth and always moved constantly of that like the Etna. For Arnold, poetry is the criticism of life under the conditions fixed for, such as criticism by the laws of poetic truth and poetic beauty. Arnold, in his poetic creation, the buried life, complete in Empedocles in Etna and other poems announced the weakness and crisis of the Victorian age. Tennyson's poetry in his early age was not as popular as his late works. His skills sharpened as his time passed. He faces hardship in his early career because of belonging to lower class as well. One of the major changes in his poetry was because of the death of his friend. The sudden death was a major shock for the poet, and we see him mourning the loss of his friend in the many of his poems. Tennyson's life seems to be a difficult ride. Its outer and worldly are taking not consideration. On the other hand, Matthew Arnold was from a middle-class family. He got good education and a lot of learned from his dad, who was also a scholar. From the fishy view, everything is normal in Arnold's life, but the real cause of disappointment, melancholy and sadness in his poems. The inner conflict that he developed by observing the society around him. He was disappointed the Christianity and society that he witnessed, and that disappointment led him to consider poetry better than religion. He believes that poetry can change hardship if portrayed in the right way. That's why his subject was the portrayal of truth without mixing any elements in it. Apart from this life, one of the major contrasts between the poets in their poetic style and forms. Arnold, being a critic, was adamant to follow the poetic truth and beauty. He wanted to portray the things stern as they were. His poetry is the voice of truth, and there is no amalgamation in it. He does not have a fixed poetic form. His lines, stanzas, and meters are vary in each of his poems, which show the boundless matches that he is trying to portray. While Tennyson, unlike Arnold, was not stern in his writing. The use of beautiful lyricism is evident in his poem. He beautifies things he portrayed, and the music that is naturally in his poems make them more applicable. Tennyson uses his own style if on of his poem The Memorial. His poetic form is more defined as Victorian period, came after Romantic period. There are hints of Romanticism in Tennyson's poetry. He has taken the effect of Romantic era and portrayed it in his poetry by focusing the natural beauty. Nature is an eminent part of Tennyson's poetry, as can be seen in his poem The Lady of Shalott. On the other hand, Arnold thought uses nature as a medium, but also portrays scientific or modern age side by side. Arnold is more inclined towards the classicist method of poetry. His poetry is stern and realistic, portraying the harsh reality of his age, as can be seen in his poem Dover Beach. Well, both of the poets stand dancing on the ground of English literature. To compare them and to come to a solid ground of judgment is too tough a task for any scholar. Still, it was my attempt to bring out their merits and qualities together. Thank you for listening.